Welcome, everybody. It's a nice group that we have and a very interesting topic that we have. I'd like to, since there are a lot of people who are new to IARPIC and new to the Health and Wellbeing Collaborative team, I'd like to take a minute or two just to give you an update on what those organizations are. First, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee created the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Collaborations to connect federal government and non-federal government researchers and other stakeholders, including those overseas, to work together to solve hard problems laid out in its 5-year plan. IARPIC is open to anyone who can contribute and includes the participation of over 1,500 members of the Arctic research community, including those from state, academic, non-governmental, industry, indigenous, and international organizations. The Health and Wellbeing Collaborative Team is one of 9 collaborative teams that meet approximately monthly via teleconference to advance research priorities. The Health and Wellbeing Team focuses on human dimensions, or the human dimension of the Arctic, the people, their challenges, and their capacity for resilience. Fundamental to the health and well-being is the connection of people to the Arctic environment and ecosystems. Consequently, many of our objectives focus on the nexus of the natural, physical, and social sciences because environmental changes affect human health and well-being in multiple ways. We value an enhanced understanding of the social determinants of health and improved well-being of Arctic residents, and we utilize a systems-based approach because of the interconnectedness among cultural, environmental, and societal factors. This particular meeting is focused on performance objective 1.4, which urges us, or by which we aim to document the prevalence and nature of violence against Alaska Native women and youth, evaluate the effectiveness of federal, state, tribal, and local responses to violence against Alaska Native women and youth, and propose recommendations to improve the effectiveness of such responses. We are fortunate to have with us today representatives from the Department of Justice and researchers working with the Department of Justice to address these performance objectives, reporting on the National Baseline Study to assess Alaska Native women's experiences with violence and victimization, health responses, service needs, and help seeking, to examine the contributions of the village public safety officers and efforts to determine effective methods to assess exposure to violence and victimization among Alaska Native youth and to improve their health and well-being. With us as well today is Mr. Tracy Toulou, Director of the Office of Tribal Justice at the Department of Justice, and he will talk with us, as you just heard, about Attorney General William Barr's recent visit to Alaska and the resulting initiatives advanced by him to address Alaska Native community needs. We invite right now everyone to, if they would like, to share announcements or recent findings, whether they're published or unpublished, ideas for collaboration, requests for future meetings, anything that you wish to share or ask. This is an opportunity to share that information with your research community and to build some connections. Okay, hearing none, I would like to...
Dottie, this is Sarah. I will just point out that we had an IARPIC staff group meeting on Monday, and one of the results of that staff group meeting is a recognition that there are profound changes happening in the Bering Strait region with diminishing sea ice or lack of the formation of cold pool and the effects on the ecosystem and the people that live and work there. And so we're going to be forming a task team to try to address how we can respond through research to some of the research needs that are arising due to these profound changes that are happening in the Bering Strait region. If anybody's interested in that, there's going to be more information that will become available on the IARPIC Collaborations website, or you can send me an email.
Since that is something that came up in the meeting that just Lisa and I were just in, Lisa, would you like to make a comment about what some of the community members had to say about this exact thing that's happening now?
Yeah, no, there's an amazing amount of stress on communities right now in many rural Alaska communities, as well as all over the state, actually, for both climate change reasons and political reasons, and the already incredibly rapid social changes that have been taking place. So lots to think about.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Or
Dottie, it's Roberto.
Go for it.
If I may, sorry to interrupt. Just a quick announcement. In early September, after Labor Day, between the 4th and 6th of the month, National Academies will be hosting an Arctic Futures 2050 conference. It's a broad sort of policy research oriented gathering that NSF is partly sponsoring that brings together scientists, indigenous peoples, and decision makers to identify different research needs. There's not necessarily a specific health focus, but it's fairly broad. I know at least one health-related panelist or attendee, Stacey Rasmus, who is a PI on the Anchor Hub that Lisa co-PIs on, and I encourage folks who are in town or willing to come to town to take a look and attempt to join us in those discussions about identifying needs. And again, it's going to be a nice integrative gathering, scientists, indigenous peoples, decision makers, a wide range of topics. If you search for Arctic Futures 2050, you can see the draft program already available, and it covers a wide range of topics from collaborations for informing policy, making science and knowledge actionable across a range of disciplines. There will be poster sessions or reception for networking, implications of change, what we need to know. And again, I just encourage folks who have a broader interest in Arctic research to make an effort to attend. Thank you.
Roberto, when and where is that again?
The meeting will be September 4th through the 6th, and it's hosted by the National Academies. There is a registration cost associated with that, so you can go to the website and they'll provide more information. Again, it's Arctic Futures 50.
Thank you very much.
This is Dave in Albuquerque. Our organization is just completing and still involved in a project for the Vera Institute, in which we're assessing provider responses to elder abuse. So if that's of interest to anyone, we would welcome input, and I can probably provide our initial report as soon as it's approved. So my email is dave@iasquared.org. Just reach me anytime.
Okay, great. Thank you. Does anyone else have something to add? Okay, I would like to then introduce Mr. Brad Myrstol. I apologize for mispronouncing your name, Brad, who's going to talk about the Village Public Safety Officers Initiative and give us the summary of the final report.
Okay, thank you, Dottie. I'm going to do my best to navigate the share screen functionality here. Hopefully that will be successful. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
You got it perfectly, thanks.
Success.
Yeah, it looks great.
This is my first time presenting. I was asked to give a short presentation, just sort of touching on some high-level things, and so that's what I've done. If you have any more detailed questions, of course, the final report for the project is available and linked on the ARPIC page, and you're welcome to email or call me at any time if you have any questions about sort of more detailed aspects of the study. Just by way of introduction here, this research was undertaken in a context of disturbingly high rates of sexual violence victimization in Alaska in general. And it was specifically an effort to better understand the criminal justice system's response to sexual violence committed against Alaska Native and American Indian women in Alaska's tribal communities. For those who may be unfamiliar, Alaska presents a very complex and fragmented system of law enforcement and public safety in Alaska. Probably very familiar to the folks on this call, but in case people are unfamiliar, Alaska essentially spans east to west, Florida to California, and north to south, Texas up to the Canadian border. So geographically, it presents some very unique public safety challenges. And tribal communities in particular up here tend to be located, though not exclusively, very frequently in remote locations that are accessible in the summertime by boat or airplane, or in winter by snow machine or airplane. And that makes the provision of public safety services very, very challenging. And as some of you may have read recently, the Anchorage Daily News and ProPublica has been doing extensive coverage about public safety in Alaska's tribal communities. And while troopers do provide coverage for the entire state, they are not physically located in villages. So this research is really trying to understand in that context how the criminal justice responds to known incidents of sexual violence committed against Alaska Native women and girls. So that's sort of a brief, big picture understanding of the genesis of the research. So I'll just dive in, and if I begin going too fast, please don't hesitate to let me know, and I'll slow down. So this particular project was supported by the National Institute of Justice, and it really built upon research that was done here at the UAA Justice Center that found that paraprofessional police officers make a significant contribution to the criminal justice response to violence, sexual violence committed in Alaska's tribal communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what paraprofessional police are, because it's something that a lot of people in the lower 48 are frankly unfamiliar with. So in Alaska's tribal communities, there's a mix of paraprofessional police, and they are not sworn police officers, but they have limited powers and sort of serve as a force multiplier to the Alaska State Troopers who do provide sworn police public safety services to villages. And the first among these, and what I'll be talking about today, is the Village Public Safety Officer Program. And that's a paraprofessional police model that was established in the late 70s, early 80s, and is funded by the state of Alaska through a fairly complex grant program to Alaska Native regional corporations, who then work with villages to place VPSOs in particular villages. Importantly, while it's funded by the state of Alaska, VPSOs are actually employees of the regional Native nonprofit corporation that they work for. So it's a grant-funded program. They're provided oversight and mentoring by Alaska State Troopers, and they also receive fairly extensive training down at the Alaska State Troopers Academy down in Sitka. The second form of paraprofessional police that we see in Alaska is what are referred to as village police officers. And these are paraprofessional police who are employed by villages, but not tribal police, which is the third form of paraprofessional police. And so in Alaska, there's a mix. Typically in most villages, there would, if they have a paraprofessional police presence, there will only be one. But in some villages, there are, for example, a VPSO and a VPO working hand in hand together. So it's a fairly complex and dynamic public safety presence. So the primary research objective that we really wanted to examine in this particular project was to try to identify and explore the extent to which there was a VPSO specific effect on the criminal justice response to sexual violence, different from an overall paraprofessional police impact. Quick overview of methods and data. In order to get the measures that we needed to be able to do a detailed dive into this process, we did a detailed case file record review at the Alaska State Troopers on site at the state crime lab. We worked for several months going through each report page by page and coding that into a database that was then cleaned and used for the analysis. In the end, we ended up with 683 sexual assault and sexual abuse of minor cases that were coded. And these were cases that were closed by the Alaska State Troopers between, I should say, January 1st, 2008 and December 31st, 2011. And it's limited to Western Alaska, what is referred to in Alaska State Trooper parlance as the C detachment. So the key measures, the things that we were looking at in this study was Vpso involvement, the extent to which Vpsos were involved in the investigation of sexual assault and sexual abuse of minor cases that were reported to the troopers. And then the primary outcome measures of interest were case processing outcomes, and in particular, the frequency with which cases, once reported to the Alaska State Troopers, were referred for prosecution to the Alaska Department of Law, and the extent to which, given referral, cases were accepted for prosecution. Whoops. So the next couple slides just provide a general overview at a pretty high level of the principal findings of the study. Overall, what we found was that paraprofessional police and Vpsos in particular are deeply involved in the investigative process when it comes to sexual violence incidents that are made known to police. Roughly 1 in 5 of those that are reported to police involve some form of paraprofessional police investigative support, and Vpsos specifically about 7.5% of the cases. Vpsos, with respect to investigative support, do a wide variety of things. As you might imagine, a village that is 200 miles away from a hub, the only person there from a public safety perspective is a Vpso. They're responsible for lots of things. I do want to highlight here that within the context of this entire conversation, that Alaska State Troopers actually lead all of the investigations, and Vpsos provide investigative support. So most of these are felony crimes, and Vpsos and other paraprofessional police are not permitted to lead those sort of investigations, but they do provide lots of support in many different ways, as well as non-criminal justice type of supports to victims, their families, and their communities. Overall, when we look at the depth of Vpso involvement, roughly 1 out of every 7 sexual assault or sexual abuse of minor investigation in Western Alaska included their participation in some form or fashion. With respect to the first key case processing outcome, what we found is that just at a univariate level, paraprofessional police really enhance the likelihood that a case, once reported, will be referred for prosecution. And Vpsos in particular, about 72.5% of the cases they're involved with end up getting referred for prosecution. This is compared to about 2/3 of Alaska State Trooper in the absence of paraprofessional assistance in the investigation, the case referral rate for that. With respect to the next stage in the criminal case process, acceptance for prosecution, again, we see a difference. Statistically, it doesn't pop, but some of that is sort of sample size issues, but about a 5% increase in the likelihood that a sexual assault or a sexual abuse of a minor case will be accepted for prosecution when paraprofessional police are involved in that investigatory process. And then when we get down to the ultimate outcome in the criminal process, conviction, it's again, statistically, no difference. What we see is about 70% of cases that involve paraprofessional police in the investigation end up ultimately resulting in conviction. So some big takeaways in this exploration of the extent to which Vpsos and their other paraprofessional police make a substantive and meaningful contribution to the criminal justice response. again, and I think oftentimes this is underestimated by lay people and to a lesser extent even researchers, is how extensive the involvement of paraprofessional police is in responding to these incidents. And very often they are the first on the scene because they're the only ones there. And so with respect to basic evidentiary concerns and the other logistic supports that VPSOs and other paraprofessional police are able to provide, it really enhances the ability to move those cases through the system. Just stepping out from a simple univariate picture to a bivariate picture, one of the things that we were, as I mentioned earlier, really specifically interested in exploring in this project was if there was a VPSO specific effect. We don't find that. We find that it is truly a paraprofessional police presence effect. Having someone in the village makes a difference. It doesn't really matter the particular model of paraprofessional police presence. It's just having someone there to respond and assist troopers with that investigation. So I think that's a major takeaway for us. You know, frankly, as we were disseminating the results of this research, there was sort of a deflation, I think, among some folks with respect to that finding. I tend to view it as a positive finding for the VPSO program, in that the VPSO program performs on par with all the other paraprofessional police models. And it's from a policy perspective, it is the model that the state funds. And so I think that's a positive outcome here from a policy perspective. In terms of multivariate analyses, these are ongoing, and some papers are in development to get these findings out. This was an unanticipated finding, but it's sort of in retrospect, perhaps it shouldn't have been so surprising, is that the paraprofessional police effect is really different between sexual assault cases and sexual abuse of a minor cases. That the impact, the positive enhancement impact, really does make a difference whether you're talking about a juvenile or a minor victim and an adult victim. And so there's a significant referral effect for SAM cases, but we've been unable to find that in SA cases in particular. And where this I think is heading, and this gets into a broader discussion of sexual assault case processing, is the role of victim non-consent, which from a legal perspective is sort of moot when it comes to sexual abuse of minor cases, as opposed to sexual assault of adult victims. And that's a complex research literature, but factors pertaining to the documentation of victim non-consent become very challenging, but very important to understand for criminal case processing. And I'd be happy to answer questions offline or even here after the presentation about that particular effect. So a bit of an auctioneer pace there. I do apologize for that, but I want to be very respectful of Tina's and everybody else's time.
Thank you, Brad. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Dr. Myrstol?
Okay.
Brad, thank you. That was really terrific. Thank you. Ina, are you ready to talk to us about the National Baseline Study of Women's Experiences?
I am. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, again, and thank you all for giving us the opportunity to talk about some interesting studies that are happening here, and it's good to see a lot of excitement. Before I kind of dive into the two studies, I always find it's very helpful, especially when you're talking about federal government agencies, exactly where we're placed, and I think it helps here because of the presenters today. So I just wanted to kind of give a really quick snapshot of how the department is configured and how we're organized, especially as it pertains to working with tribal communities. So I do want to point out first that you do see the Office of Tribal Justice there circled. That's the department's dedicated point of contact for Indian country, specifically as it pertains to legal and policy matters. And you can hear more about that from Tracy later after my presentation. I also want to point out a couple of other offices and bureaus. I want to focus in on the 3 grant-making components of the department, which is the Office of Justice Programs, which is circled in red, along with the Community-Oriented Policing Services Office and the Office on Violence Against Women. These 3 components report to the Associate Attorney General of the United States, and they are responsible for awarding federal financial assistance to support law enforcement and public safety activities in state, local, and tribal jurisdictions. We're also to assist victims of crime, to provide training and technical assistance, to conduct research and evaluation, and to implement programs that improve the criminal and civil and justice systems. So this slide identifies the 8 specific grant-making components in the department by name. However, I just want to focus on 2 components that I've highlighted in red. These 2 components are the 2 science agencies within the department, and they just happen to be housed within the Office of Justice Programs. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics is the primary statistical agency of the department. They collect, analyze, publish, and disseminate information on crime, criminal offenders, crime victims, and criminal justice operations. They also provide financial and technical support to state, local, and tribal governments to improve their statistical capabilities and the quality and the utility of the criminal history records. The other science agency is the National Institute of Justice, referred to commonly as NIJ, which is referred to as the Research, Development, and Evaluation arm of the department. So NIJ's scientific offices fund and direct and manage a wide range of social and behavioral science projects. And we also develop technical standards and testing protocols for equipment that specifically address the needs of law enforcement, corrections, and other criminal justice agencies. For example, public safety bomb suits, body armor, handheld metal detectors, just to name a few. And then NIJ's Office of Investigative and Forensic Sciences is the federal government's lead agency for forensic science research and development, as well as the administration of funds that facilitate training, improve laboratory efficiency, and reduce backlogs. As the evaluation arm of the department, we at NIJ also assess programs, policies, and technologies. NIJ primarily funds extramural projects via grants, similar to Brad's, cooperative agreements and contracts that are awarded to educational institutions, public agencies, nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations, and others, and in rare cases to some individuals. So as it pertains to our tribal crime and justice research, NIJ has increased its emphasis on research and, among other areas, the administration of justice, drugs and crime, policing, and victimization. And specific to NIJ's tribal program, we seek to fund equitable and mutually beneficial projects that are created by a tribal researcher partnership. And we try to ensure that the research we support is collaborative and participatory from birth to grave, and is always transparent, and whenever possible ensures community capacity building. The studies listed on this slide are just a few that NIJ has funded and or is currently directing. You've already heard about the Vpso study. I want to quickly mention the research report on violence against American Indian Alaska Native women and men that was authored by Dr. André Rosay from the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I believe he has joined us now, and completed during his NIJ Visiting Executive Fellowship. So his study highlights NIJ's growing body of research on tribal crime and justice issues, but more importantly, it provides the first set of estimates from the National Large-Scale Survey of Victimization among self-identified American Indian Alaska Native women and men on psychological aggression, coercive control and entrapment, physical violence, stalking, and sexual violence. His research provides the most comprehensive, reliable, and valid estimates on the victimization experiences of American Indian Alaska Native women and men today. So as I mentioned, Doctor's report has been very important and it contributes to the body of knowledge that we have, but the study does not examine victimization of American Indian Alaska Native people living in Indian country and Alaska villages. Accurate, comprehensive, and current information on the incident, prevalence, and nature of the victimization experienced by American Indian Alaska Native people from these communities is critical if we're going to be able to improve our understanding about the programmatic service and policy needs of these victims. Congress addressed this need by mandating, as part of the Violence Against Women and Department of Justice Reauthorization Act of 2005, NIJ, in consultation with our Office on Violence Against Women, conduct analyses and research on violence against Indian women living in Indian country and in Alaska villages. In conducting its analyses and research, we were asked to focus on dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, sex trafficking, stalking, and murder. And as a result, NIJ developed a comprehensive program consisting of multiple projects, similar to what the Vpso program is part of, that we will be accomplished over an extended period of time, with the primary goal being to document the prevalence and nature of violence against Indian women living on sovereign tribal lands. The capstone of the program is referred to the National Baseline Study, which is a study of public health, wellness, and safety in tribal communities, and will be the first of its kind involving the largest number of federally recognized tribes. So the baseline study seeks better information on domestic violence, sexual violence, and stalking perpetrated against Native women living on tribal lands and Alaska Native communities. So under the direction of NIJ, the study will capture important information on lifetime and recent victimization, that's in the last 12 months, available resource services, perceptions of public safety, and opinions on law enforcement response. Participants will also be asked more in-depth questions about the impact of their victimization. And finally, the survey will ask about the strengths of tribal communities so that we can better understand how we can best support tribal communities to prevent and respond to violence. I should also mention that the instruments were designed to crosswalk to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, as well as the Alaska Victimization Survey. So of particular importance is the baseline instrument was designed to help address not only health and legal services and outcomes, but also issues in criminal jurisdiction, particularly for victims living on tribal lands. This information from the study is expected to inform prevention and intervention efforts focused on all Indian people, keeping in mind that such efforts must be tailored to meet the specific needs arising from the different types of victimizations experienced. The data collection instrument was developed after extensive consultation with tribal governments, tribal service providers, and other tribal organizations. It was developed in participants with a variety of subject matter experts, along with a federal advisory task force that's part of this mandate, which is convened and managed by the Office on Violence Against Women. And the task force is comprised of representatives from tribal governments, National Tribal Domestic Sexual Violence nonprofit organizations, and other national tribal organizations. So the questionnaire will be administered in person using a combination of computer-assisted personal interviewing and audio-computer-assisted self-interviewing technology. Field interviewers will administer the questionnaire from the front end, for the front end and the back end sections of the questionnaire. ACASI will be used for the most sensitive sections of the questionnaire pertaining to victimization history and impact. In addition, the study laptop incorporates computer-assisted recording interviewing software to provide quality assurance and quality control by recording portions of the interview periodically. Interviews will be conducted in public locations, but private settings, for example, a conference room in the community library or tribal office. Interviews will never take place in a participant's residence. This is a lengthy interview at approximately 60 minutes, and participants are provided $35 to compensate them for their time. Both the length and the compensation amounts were items that tested during the pilot phase. Whenever possible and with tribal government permission, local community members are hired to be site coordinators, field interviewers, and translators when needed. In most cases, these are Native American women from the community. In cases where the tribal government requested non-community members to be interviewers to protect participants' confidentiality, a national team of field interviewers are deployed to the site for the 3 to 4 week data collection period. Other types of service that the study covers include child care, transportation, and behavioral specialists for participants when needed. The baseline study is a multi-year study being conducted in geographically dispersed tribal communities in the lower 48 and Alaska, using an NIJ-developed sampling strategy for which the primary aim is to provide an accurate national victimization rate of violence committed against Native women, women living in Indian country and Alaska Native villages. Key elements taken into consideration in this design included whether federally recognized tribes had designated land, a tribe's population, jurisdiction and state, such as whether it was in Public Law 280 versus non-Public Law 280, BIA service areas, Indian Health Service areas, and of course the census tribal populations as self-reported. The multi-stage sampling plan provides a practical and accurate approach that involves enlisting a large number of federally recognized tribes and randomly selecting households from each participating tribe in which all adult American Indian Alaska Native women, that is, those that are 18 years or older, in the household will be approached to participate in the study. A graduated informed consent process is being employed for safety and ethical considerations, and this process also allows for the interviewer to build rapport and increase the likelihood of gaining the participants' trust. As it pertains to the multiple tribal nations participating in the study, NIJ has agreed to not disclose their participation. However, if a tribe wishes to disclose their involvement, they may do so. So one of the reasons for the delays in getting this study implemented has to do with the level of engagement that's required. First, given this is a federally directed study, NIJ has engaged with every tribal government in the sample in writing and in person to also include coordinating with national Native American organizations like the National Congress of American Indians and the Alaska Federation of Natives. For every participating tribe, tribal permission has been or will be secured via executed tribal resolutions, followed by participatory agreements, and tribal institutional review boards review and approval. Specific protocols have been put in place regarding tribal data and information transfers outlined in data agreements in order for study staff to access sampling sources such as tribal census data, tribal housing lists, and tribal voter registration lists. This process also involves a lot of tribal program involvement with an emphasis on community capacity building at the tribal level. For each of those locations, once the catchment area, which is the service area, has been defined, introductory letters are sent to households followed by face-to-face recruitment with up to 5 attempts. During this phase, all eligible adult women in the selected households that identify as American Indian and Alaska Native are approached to voluntarily participate in this study. The study staff has developed a marketing plan where study activities and findings will be disseminated via web pages, bulletins, webinars, tribal community newsletters, and media articles and manuscripts throughout the study period to continually increase awareness and keep stakeholders informed and updated about the study. Final results will be shared with participating tribes via a closed webinar prior to any release of findings, such that their input and recommendations can be incorporated into the final report. So this very quickly shows you how this is structured as far as the study goes. NIJ is serving as the principal investigator with assistance from 2 contractors. So based on the work that we completed during the pilot phase, it was determined that key tasks needed to be and should be led by Native American researchers. Therefore, we parsed out the tasks into 2 separate contracts. The National Baseline Study Research Contractor has primary responsibility for implementing and managing the tribal research sites, and the National Baseline Study Data Center Contractor is responsible for data collection, processing, and data management. So we recently completed the procurement crossmith to reboot this study. We did have to close it because the contract period ended and we had to go out and rebid this. Fortunately, the incumbent American Indian Development Associates, under the direction of Ada Picos Milton, was awarded the contract in May and has already started to reinitiate outreach to our participating sites. And as you can see from the organizational chart, the research contractor employs and trades a good number of tribal community members across the country. The other contract for the study, the data center, was literally awarded a week ago to the incumbent, which happens to be RTI International, and their kickoff is scheduled for next week. So before I jump to the next project, I'll just take a second to see if anybody has any questions at this point pertaining to the National Baseline Study. Hearing none, I'll talk about the next study, which is titled Methodological Research to Support NIJ's Program of Research Examining Violence and Victimization of American Indian and Alaska Native Youth. I think the research team realized real quick they couldn't make an acronym out of that, so they immediately truncated it to the Tribal Youth Victimization Study. So you'll hear us refer to this as the TYVS more often. So this effort came about because there was never been a national study of tribal youth regarding their victimization experiences. that provides reliable and valid estimates of the scope of the problem. So as a result, the incidence, prevalence, and nature of victimization experienced by American Indian, Alaska Native youth and young adults is unknown for those that are enrolled, affiliated, or descendants of a federally recognized tribe living in Indian country, Alaska Native villages or hub areas, or other tribal settings such as off-reservation boarding schools, parochial dormitories near reservations for students attending public schools, and tribal colleges. So because this area remains an understudied issue that suffers from a lack of scientifically rigorous research, NIJ, in partnership with our sister agencies, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention and the Office for Victims of Crime, funded a method study that is supporting the development and testing of a questionnaire and modes of delivery with the ultimate goal that should funds become available, a national victimization study could be implemented using the interview and tested protocols. So under this effort, the 5 key study objectives are provided for your review on the slide. The project goals are to develop and test a process for collecting self-report data from American Indian, Alaska Native youth and young adults that identifies factors that increase violence and victimization risks for youth and young adults, that identifies protective factors that can eliminate and reduce risk, and that addresses methodological issues that limit the availability, interpretability, and applicability of the data in a tribal context. So the goal of the Tribal Youth Victimization Survey instrument was to be comprehensive and include measures of exposure to abuse, neglect, sexual offenses, hate crimes, bullying, peer and school assault, and exposure to domestic and community violence. So the challenges for this study were to align Western and Indigenous methodologies, design a measurement process that documents unique situations for tribal youth and young adults, and captures issues that they may have in common with their peers across the country. So this study intends to reflect the realities of these very diverse American Indian, Alaska Native communities while incorporating conventional concepts of violence, victimization, and trauma, child welfare, justice, mental health, and well-being into a valid measurement process. The survey design began with a review of scholarly literature to identify similar studies and relevant factors, concepts, and constructs that influence youth and young adult experiences with violence and victimization. The literature review ultimately helped to select key constructs that are being measured, and you can see those on the screen, find and select the appropriate measurement instruments for further review, anticipate common issues and problems in the research context, and finally identify possible future data comparisons between other race and ethnic populations. So the study sample was to include tribal youth and young adults between the ages of 12 and 20. Cognitive testing was conducted in 2 sites, one in Alaska and one in the Southwest, and involved a total of 33 respondents. The cognitive testing included 9 to 12 youth in each of the following age cohorts: those 12 to 14 years of age, those 15 to 17 years of age, and those 18 to 20. The reason 12-year-olds were ultimately removed from the sample was because during the cognitive testing phase, it became apparent that the age of 12 may be too young for the complex and very evasive inquiry that's being developed for this particular study. Therefore, modifications were made to the sampling plan. Recruitment for the cognitive testing was primarily through snowball sampling technique, with a concerted effort made to recruit participants in different situations, such as hard-to-reach populations, such as homeless youth, those that are justice involved, such as juveniles on probation, or those involved with victim service programs. Currently, the team is pilot testing the instrument as we speak, literally. There are 3 sites currently collecting data, each testing a different mode of administration with each site's sample goal of 125 completed interviews. The 3 different modes of administration include computer-assisted self-interviewing, and for those that may be unfamiliar, it's a technique in which the respondent uses an electronic device to answer questions, and there's no interviewer present. An audio computer-assisted self-interviewing method is also being used, and this is a process in which the participant listens to pre-recorded questions through headphones and responds to questions by selecting their answers on a touch screen or keypad. Respondents may simultaneously read the questions from a tablet screen, or they may close or hide the screen for complete privacy. And finally, at the 3rd site, we're using audio computer-assisted personal interviewing, where an interview asks the questions and records the respondent answers on the screen. Another aspect of this particular study is testing compensation or incentives. In other words, does compensation affect respondent participation? There are 3 scenarios described here. A different approach is being tested at each of the locations. All materials, including the informed consents and the assents, have been modified for each location with regard to the mention of compensation. In addition, participants are then later asked at the end and completion of the questionnaire their feedback on the compensation and participation in the study. So following the pilot, which we hope to end probably in September, and the preparation of the data files, the research team will conduct a detailed evaluation and analysis of the paradata. They'll also conduct detailed analysis to estimate the potential bias in the study's approach. A broad range of metrics will be used to assess reliability and validity, and these metrics include but not are limited to response rates and representatives of the sample, qualitative examination of narratives, cost per interview, data quality, and reporting accuracy. We do anticipate the study's completion in January or February of 2020, which will be sure to come back and hopefully present to you all here if you're of interest for that. And then I just want to add one last item, so we have time for Tracy to speak here, is 2 upcoming consultations that may be of interest to the group, and hopefully is a good segue for Tracy to speak. So the Office on Violence Against Women will be holding their annual government-to-government tribal consultation later this month on August 21st and 22nd in New Buffalo, Michigan. This is an annual consultation held to solicit recommendations from tribal leaders on the following 3 topics: enhancing the safety of American Indian Alaska Native women from domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking; strengthening the federal response to the crimes of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, stalking, and sex trafficking; and administering funds and programs administered by the Office on Violence Against Women. This is the 14th annual consultation on violence against Indian women. In addition, there is another consultation happening at the very same venue that same week. On August 20th, the Office for Victims of Crime is also holding a consultation to hear from tribal leaders regarding how current and potential future tribal set-aside funding from the Federal Crime Victims Fund should be programmed. The web address on the slide will take you to the official site for those that may be interested in learning more about both of these events. And with that, I don't know if anybody has any questions at this point. We can open that up, but there's my information is available to you all. It's also attached and uploaded to the website, so if anybody'd like to contact me offline or at a later date to get updates or to have any other questions answered, I'll be more than glad to do that.
Does anyone have any questions or comments? Then I would like to turn the meeting over to
Tina, I'm sorry, I didn't realize I was muted in 2 different places. Sorry about that, y'all. I am going to be contacting you, Tina, about some methodological questions about the pilot study, but I was curious, you're implying that you're going to be able to make your slides available. Is that correct? Will we be able to post them on the IARPC website, for example?
I've already uploaded them, so they are up there.
Well. That is so splendid. Thank you so much for sharing the information about your upcoming events. That's very, very exciting to hear. Thank you. That was it.
Thanks.
Great. Okay. So I would like to now turn the conversation over to Director Tracy Toulou from the Office of Tribal Justice.
So hi, this is Tracy. Thanks a lot for the opportunity to talk today. I think I'm going to try to keep this fairly brief, but I'm going to break it into 3 areas. First, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what our office does. Then I want to talk to you about how the department interfaces with Native communities generally, because it's different in Alaska, and I think it's important to understand that. And then I'm going to talk briefly about the AG's trip, and would be happy to answer any questions or go into any part of that brief presentation in more detail. So my office, the Office of Tribal Justice, has three primary purposes, and I'll run through those. We're a small office, but we are a leadership office, which means we report directly to the Deputy Attorney General and regularly interface with the Attorney General, like a lot of much bigger offices than ours. The things that we do are, number one, we're the primary point of contact for tribes when they come into the Department of Justice. A lot of you are involved with organizations that interface regularly with tribes, while tribes interface with the justice system. The Department of Justice is kind of a complex lawyer-based organization. There are a lot of hoops to jump through, and it's important that tribes have an easy access point to the work we provide, whether that's litigation on behalf of tribes or our involvement in the criminal justice system, civil rights, or any of a number of other activities. So we're there to help tribes work through that process. Number two, we're the legal and policy advisors for the Attorney General on what we call Indian law, and then Indian law includes Native Alaskans. It's an old term, going back to Title 25 of the U.S. Code, which is entitled Indians, but it does include Native Alaskans. Indian law is a unique study law. Most lawyers do not go into it, but there are specific canons and constructions and way we interpret things, precedential case law that's different from other areas of law, and we're there to help the components who are working on litigation make sure that we take into consideration those unique interpretations and also the cultural and social realities that exist in Indian country and in Alaska. Also, as part of that, we kind of 1 and 2, we are the conduit for consultation with tribes. We are the entity that is responsible for ensuring that the executive order on consultation is carried out appropriately, and that entities within the department that have issues they need to consult with tribes on do that in a way that is responsible and recognizes tribal sovereignty. The third thing we do is we interface with agencies and entities on public safety matters outside of the Department of Justice. So that would be the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Law Enforcement Office, Office of Justice Services, state entities, tribal law enforcement, and also organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So we're there to make sure on public safety matters there is a coordinated voice involving Indian and Alaska Native related issues. So that's who we are. Hello, I think I lost somebody. Yeah, so that's what we do. Let me tell you briefly about what the department does in public safety outside of Alaska. And much of the United States, not all of it, we have direct prosecutorial responsibilities, we being the Department of Justice. We realize that through the U.S. Attorney's offices. They handle the major crimes that would occur in Indian country, and Indian country is a term of art that does not include Alaska. And so if there is a murder on on Pine Ridge Reservation or the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana or Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, it would be the U.S. Attorney's Office who is prosecuting that crime. Same is true for sexual assaults, and I heard someone talking about crimes against children. All those would be handled by the federal government. The tribe has concurrent jurisdiction; they may also prosecute, but the substantial prison sentences and rehabilitation opportunities go through the federal government. We do not do that in a handful of states that are called Public Law 280 states, and that's where Congress has decided the states have jurisdiction. One of those handful, 6 states, is Alaska. So we do not have criminal justice responsibilities specific to somebody being indigenous in an indigenous area in Alaska. In addition, we work in what's called Indian country, and I heard Christine talking about Indian country. Indian country is a term of art that refers to a jurisdictional area. Often it's a reservation, but there's some other definitions over which a tribe and the federal government has jurisdiction of some level, absent Public Law 280. In Alaska, because of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and because of case that interprets that act called Venati, there is very little Indian country in Alaska. There are a lot of Native people living in areas that are controlled predominantly by Native people, but we do not have that jurisdictional hook we have in the lower 48. And I think that's important to understanding why the federal government is not as involved in public safety issues in Alaska as we are, say, in Montana or North Dakota or New Mexico or Arizona, places like that. It would seem natural that we would have those same responsibilities there. But Congress has decided years ago, mostly in the 50s, and then when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed, which was later, but still has been 30, 40 years ago now, that scenario was changed. So with that backdrop, we were invited to go to Alaska by the two senators from Alaska. And so the Attorney General decided that was going to be one of his first trips up to Alaska. He had some background in Indian law generally from his first stint in the department and with at that point, the Reagan administration. But this is I think his first trip really out to a Native community. And it was a fairly substantial trip. We went to Anchorage, which everybody kind of does, but we also ended up going to a number of more remote places. We went to Bethel, which is still fairly easy to get to, but we also went to Galena, which is a roadless community off the road system, and we did that by plane. And then we went to Nepasiac, which is close to Bethel, but accessible only on the river. So we got out to some places that most people don't see who would go out to Alaska, and we're exposed to many of the issues I think we've already discussed. One of the things that really, I think, impacted the Attorney General was the realization that about a third of Alaska Native villages have no law enforcement at all. That means nobody responding unless the troopers fly in, and given, the problems with transportation in Alaska and the low number of troopers, we're under 200 for the entire rural part of the state, means that most places effectively have no law enforcement. Given the isolation, substance abuse problems, breakdown of cultural norms that unfortunately hit all indigenous communities at one time or another, it seems. We're concerned that it's a fairly high crime rate. Some of what you guys or other people were talking about regarding statistics will be helpful in that, but I can tell you, as somebody who was a prosecutor before I came to this office, and I worked in Indian country and have spent time in Alaska, I'm fairly confident that there's a fairly high crime rate that's just not being addressed out there. He was taken by that and asked us to look at ways that we, given the constraints we have in not having direct jurisdiction, could reach out, we being the department, and try to assist Alaska communities in getting law enforcement out on the ground. And to that end, we began immediately on returning to Washington to look at grant funding opportunities, and there was an initial set of grants that were announced that amounted to about $10 million. Clearly, that's just a very initial deposit on what's going on, and we've been tasked with coming up with follow-on suggestions on how to deal with this. We have a COPS program that allows for hiring of police officers, but we understand from our work across Indian country in the lower 48 that having officers in place are just one part of the equation. We need victim service advocates, which is something we think we can provide. There's going to need to be some better access to court systems beyond what the state of Alaska currently provides, and some sort of sanctioning or treatment system that would deal with the back end of the criminal justice system. It will be a long-term project with long-term commitments. I think the department understands what it needs to do. It's not our primary mandate. It's not what we do because of the jurisdictional issues. That could change because the congressional delegation was involved, and clearly part of the reason we are where we are is because the laws don't support our interaction in the way we would in the lower 48. But we're trying to be creative and find ways that we can get people out to the villages, whether that's through some sort of change in the current hiring process. We had the presentation on the VPSOs, VPOs, and TPOs. Or whether it's just further funding the existing systems is up in the air. Currently, we're providing funding for a number of additional VPOs and TPOs and have provided funding to the state, which could be used for additional VPSOs. But, again, this is a long-term problem. It's it's taken 50 years since statehood, 60 years for it to really come to the point where it is. It's going to take a while to fix, but we're in this for the long term and are interested in creative thinking about how we can do this in maybe a better way than we've done it in other places. So that's where we are. So that's my spiel. Would take any questions, comments, are welcome.
So have you put out announcements or calls for proposal, and how are you publicizing those through, is that done through the Federal Register, or how do you get out the word that this grant money is available or has been available?
So there are two different areas we're talking about. The initial emergency funding has to go through the state, and that was $6 million. That's set up, again, these are all programs that are mandated through Congress and the way that they're put together. That particular program was set up for meeting unique one-time emergencies. We saw the public safety crisis in Alaska as an emergency, so it's money we would use after a hurricane or after a mass shooting, things of that sort. It can only be made available to the state. That money is already in the process of being made available to the state of Alaska to support rural law enforcement. Our other grant programs are generally run through a program called CTAS, which is Consolidated Tribal Application System. Tribes in Alaska already have access to that funding. What we're doing is prioritizing their access to that funding. It comes out in a yearly basis and covers everything from hiring police officers to setting up tribal courts to juvenile justice and delinquency programs. There is a third area that's been unique for the last 2 years, which is money through the Crime Victims Fund. There's been a set aside for tribal nations generally of $167 million this year. We went out and did 2 webinars in Alaska, besides the general webinars that were available in the lower 48 over the last few weeks, to let tribes know that the money for victim services is available. Almost all of our funds go directly to tribal governments.
So Tracy, thanks. That was really helpful, and I think you just answered the question that I have. So IARPC is the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, and in the presentation that Christine gave us, and thanks for that organizational chart, Christine, because it was really helpful to putting that right at the start. But are any of these funds set aside for any research efforts or not?
So there are funds, and Christine can probably speak to this better than I can, that are outside of the Consolidated Tribal Application System that I know are used for research. That's how some of the research she was talking about is being funded. She's in a better position to describe that. I think we're always interested in research because, as I think we all realize, there isn't enough information about what's really going on in tribal areas. We know there's a problem, but to effectively target the additional, the grant funds that we have, we need to have a better sense of the problem. So, Christine, do you want to talk about research funding and all?
Sure. So for some of the program of research that I talked about, that actually comes from a congressional mandate. We do have funds that are provided specifically for that, but they're actually very small in number. A lot of the work that we have funded here at the National Institute of Justice is usually taken out of our base funds for discretionary investigator initiative work. I can tell you that we have really struggled at the Institute. If you go to the NIJ website, nij.gov, and you go to funding and awards, you can go into the archives to see the solicitations that we have released. And every year, at least for the last decade, we have submitted one or more tribal-focused solicitations looking at a research and evaluation on a number of different topics and areas. But the number of applications that we actually receive is extremely low, and the quality of the proposals technically don't usually make technical merit. So we have a very difficult time. So one of the things that we've been trying to address is capacity building at the research and evaluation level. So we know that there's very few researchers out there that are able to work in this area. Those that are doing it well, like Brad and Andre, have a full plate on their hands, and so they can't constantly be applying. But we're highly encouraging more folks to apply. And we have been trying to figure out how best to do that. So in the last 2 years, we have released a solicitation, the Tribal Researcher Capacity Building Program, because one of the areas that we heard that was difficult, especially when you're trying to develop partnerships, is we need a planning period in which the researcher scientists have time to develop a proposal from conception, where they actually help with the research questions and so forth. So we've been providing funding for an 18-month planning period where a researcher in a tribal nation or a tribal organization can work together to develop a research proposal. And at the end of that 18-month period, one of the final deliverables is a criminal justice research or evaluation proposal that NIJ will consider funding. That first cycle for the FY18, of course, hasn't ended. We won't know whether we'll have anything fundable until the 2020 season. But we have plans to continue that effort for the next 5 or so years, just to see if we can build up capacity in that area. But we definitely like to work with this group to try to get the word out when we do have these solicitations available and really encourage researchers to apply.
I think you mentioned an issue that we at NIH experienced as well, and I don't know, I think if Angela is on the phone, she could maybe speak to SAMHSA and Roberto to NSF, and that is that it takes a while to build up interest and capacity and knowledge about funding announcements and funding possibilities. So we have a tribal epidemiology center that, a center's initiative that seeks to partner academic and tribal epicenter researchers to address data gaps, which are many in our understanding of health issues and health outcomes in Native communities. And it is very slow in getting critical mass of applications, and also, as you mentioned, applications that are worthy of being picked up for funding. So I think that you really raised some important issues, and maybe there would be an opportunity for us to think about collaborating on some of that.
Absolutely.
Does anyone else have a comment or question? Or
Christine, this is Sarah again. Where would I go to the NIJ website to get more information about that capacity building
Sure.
system?
If you go to the website, it should be, if you just type in the search nij.gov, and you're there at the home page. Mm-hmm. If you'll see at the top of the screen, one of the options is funding. And if you hit that selection, it'll take you to a page. And on that page, I believe on the left side, I'm pulling it up right now. I'm doing this by memory, which is not good at my age. it will say current opportunities, or expired opportunities. And one of the things that I would encourage folks there to do is not only look at what types of solicitations we've issued over the last few years, but also we make available what we have awarded. So you'll have an idea about the awards that have been funded. All of that is easily accessible on the website. I can tell you, as far as our funding cycles go, we're of course coming close to the end of the fiscal year. We are already working on solicitations for the new fiscal year. We are not allowed to disclose any ideas or anything that we may be doing in the coming year, but usually our solicitations, at least in the last 5 years, have tended to be posted starting in December or early January. They'll close as late as May or June, depending on what the schedule is. We've just already completed our peer review season and already handed over our funding decision. So usually our awardees will be notified in the August, September, and in rare cases, early October timeframe.
Thank you very much.
Sarah, there was a question from Rick Berzon. Would you be able to unmute him?
Yes.
Please, thank you.
I will try. So he must be on a phone. I unmuted the 301 number. I'm not sure if that's you.
That would be 301-594-8949.
Yeah, so I've unmuted that. Yep, you're good to go, Rick.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So I thought that was a very thorough talk. I was curious about the statistic that 1/3 of the villages and towns and cities and so forth in Alaska don't seem to have any sort of coverage around justice. Is that right?
Yeah, that's from the ProPublica series of articles that were done with the Alaska Daily News. Is that what it is? Yeah, Alaska Daily News. And it's consistent with what we've heard from our partners. It's not our statistic, but it seemed well researched, and it's kind of what we were seeing when we were out there. So, yeah.
So are there any plans? That seems awfully high for this.
Yes, doesn't it? That's what our thought was, too.
Are there any plans to address that in some way?
Well, I mean, that's part of what the Attorney General has asked us to attempt to do. And that the $6 million that went to the state of Alaska, the way village public safety officers are hired is from grants from the state of Alaska to the 12 regional organizations that are in Alaska. So some of that money could be used to assist with hiring of officers. We also provided about $4 million in COPS grants. I don't have the number of officers in front of me, but I think it was around an additional 12 or 14 officers in this year's funding that would be hired there. So that's, about 20% of the villages would potentially have coverage, at least 20% that could be put out there in villages. And going forward, we're been asked to prioritize our grant-making opportunities so individuals could be hired. That said, the state has the responsibility for providing law enforcement in those areas. It isn't, I mean, as much as we want to be involved and try to work through this problem, it's not legally a federal responsibility through Public Law 280 and the Native Alaska Claims Settlement Act. It's a state responsibility. Unfortunately, because of the drop in oil prices, the state is having problems with their budget. So we're going to continue to work on it. We're going to continue to make our funds available, even though they're not specifically designed for those purposes. But we would be very interested in creative thinking and how we can maximize outreach and provide those services.
I mean, it would seem that degree of lack of law enforcement would contribute to the degree of violence that is there within the state.
Yes, we would think that was the case. I can't see how it would not. And we were frankly shocked that was where it was, and certainly it caught the Attorney General's attention in a very real way. And this is as much, kind of very quick, focused activity that I've seen out of the agency in years, frankly, and I think it was because of those numbers.
Dottie, this is Brad. Can I jump in real quick?
Please jump in.
Yeah, just as a point of clarification for folks on the coverage with respect to that statistic is that's really referencing whether or not there is a public safety or law enforcement presence on the ground in a village or Alaska Native community. So just to be clear, the Alaska State Troopers do provide service to all communities. They just may not be located on site. And that creates certain challenges, definitely. But I think oftentimes that statistic is thrown out and people think that there's no access to public safety services or other state resources, and that's not really accurate. There's often delay due to weather and geography and those sorts of things. But it's just whether or not there's somebody on site in a village or not.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think when I started, I mentioned that the State Patrol responds everywhere. The fact of the matter is, though, it's often days before anybody can get there, even on a serious situation. We've had reports that are documented of response because of weather. I'm not blaming the State Patrol, but because of weather, murder victims, having to be guarded by non-law enforcement for days before we can get a state trooper in. It really impacts how public safety is provided, even though the best interests of the state or best intentions of the state might be to get there in time and do what they need to do. And as a result, we think it likely that people aren't reporting crimes. Obviously, murders are a crime that's going to be reported, but sexual assault, child sexual abuse, domestic violence are all crimes that we, in other areas, and we believe this is probably true in Alaska too, see better response if we have access immediately for the victims to law enforcement. If not, they're concerned that they're going to be re-victimized and often don't report. Given the low number of state troopers and the difficulties, and that most of these villages are not on the road system, really does impact the provision of services in a way you wouldn't see in the lower 48.
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion and very timely in many ways. I believe, am I saying it right, Sarah, that the meeting has been recorded?
Yes, it has been, and the recording will be posted sometime next week on the site, on the IARPIC Collaborations website.
Okay, because I know that there are researchers in the lower 48 who are very interested in this issue and might be interested in some of the opportunities with the Department of Justice for funding for research. And some of them, the scholars who have gotten in touch with me at least, are Native scholars as well as academic partners with Native communities. I know that Navajo Nation has been interested and has reached out to some academic partners as well. So perhaps we can be in touch with you, Tina, and you, Mr. Toulou, that we could, and probably you as well, Brad, that there would be people who would be able to be pulled into the network to work on some of these issues. In just closing, I would like to thank everyone for their time and attention. It's now 3:30, and this has been a wonderful discussion, and we appreciate your coming. Our next meeting will be a One Health report, and it'll be a quarterly meeting, and the announcement of that meeting will be put up on the web shortly. Sarah, do you have anything more?
No, just to really thank all the speakers. Great presentations, and like Dottie said, really timely and useful information. I do think there are opportunities for collaboration here, particularly in this area of capacity building. And so let's stay in touch. And as reports are getting finalized, I think, Tina, you were saying that there will be one coming out. If you could post those to the website, that will be very helpful and allow us to wrap up the performance elements that we're committed to doing as part of our 5-year plan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.